I'd like to give you an overview of the rigorous curriculum design model. It's interesting because now that the Common Core state standards have been published and have been in use for quite some time, educators are talking about the curricular materials that they need to impart the standards to the students. And one of the quotations that I really appreciated so much from the Common Core State Standards Initiative webinar in 2010 was this one that you see on screen right now, that the standards themselves are insufficient. They have to be partnered with a content-rich curriculum, robust assessments, both aligned closely to the standards. We feel that that solution is being provided through the model called Rigorous Curriculum Design. If you'll notice the subtitle, rather lengthy, but I intentionally wanted to capture the idea that the key focus was going to be on alignment. Alignment between the standards, between instruction, and also assessment, and how those connections of those practices and components all will fit together to produce units of study that will help educators prepare their students for the new assessments and then ultimately for college and career readiness. So what I'd like to give you now is a brief overview, I call it a curriculum roadmap, of a do-it-yourself process that I developed that educators, part of curriculum design teams, that they can follow over time to create a rigorous curriculum in any content area. Now, it is true that primarily the focus is on English language arts and mathematics, because those are the two primary content areas that have been developed and presented and implemented now across the nation. But really, this process will work in every single content area. One of the graphics that I like to show that represents the comprehensiveness of this model is this one here. It shows that it's based on the priority standards and the supporting standards, that it also leads to the unwrapping of those standards to determine exactly what students need to know and be able to do within the wording of the standards. It also represents big ideas or enduring understandings and essential questions. So these first two components really address the standards that are part of this model. Then we move into the assessment piece, common formative assessments that are pre and post around units of study, along with checks for understanding that are informal, ungraded, that teachers administer throughout the unit of study to determine how students are doing so they can make in-course adjustments along the way. A powerful way for students to learn is to have them involved in active, hands-on learning, which we're calling authentic performance tasks with scoring guides or rubrics. And then lastly, we want to make sure that the instructional strategies that we select and use are the ones that are most appropriate to move all students to levels of proficiency. Before previewing the rigorous curriculum design model and its various steps, I'd like to give a brief overview of what I call the systems approach, or the big picture, to show how all those components actually are fitting together to prepare students for success on assessments. So I'd call this, as I mentioned, the big picture, because it begins with the state standards at the bottom, and then the state assessments, and then the national assessments at the top. And then right in the middle you see a square which I call the organizing building block of the whole model. It's the rigorous curricular unit of study based on the unwrapped priority standards. We're going to be, first of all, prioritizing so that we have the priority standards and the supporting standards clearly decided. And then all of those standards are going to be placed into units of study, and those units will then be scoped and sequenced, which means, for example, in a 6th grade class for math, we would know the units of study, and then we would know what order those units would be taught. But within each one of those units, all of those priority and supporting standards that have already been prioritized will actually be housed, so to speak, in the units for the grade level. And then what occurs around each one of the units themselves is a common formative pre-assessment followed by the data team's analysis. And then the teaching begins, the unit ensues, the teachers are using quick checks for understanding along the way. And as the unit completes or nears completion, a post-assessment is given, and again the data team or the instructional data team meets to diagnose student learning needs, find out which kids were doing well, which kids need further instruction, remediation, and so on. In fact, this last component is before they move on to the next unit of study, there's a period of what we call the buffer week. It might just be a couple of days, couple class periods, But during that buffer, children that still need a little bit more instruction receive remediation, or they may need some further intervention. The kids that are demonstrating proficiency at the end of that unit are going to receive enrichment. And the idea is that these practices of the common formative pre and post assessment with the instructional strategies, the checks along the way, the data analysis, and then the plan to continuously meet the learning needs of the students, that will circulate around each one of those units of study. And the idea is if we align those units then with what students will need to demonstrate on state assessments and these smarter balance and PARCC assessments, we will get predictive value in terms of what do we need to do from a formative assessment point of view so that we can move students toward proficiency on those summative national assessments. So that's what I call the big picture, and it helps people to understand as they begin the rigorous curriculum design process that every single one of the components that you see on screen is intentionally aligned and connected to all the others. So it does create that systems approach to student achievement. Well, now I'll give you the overview of part 2, which is what I call building the curricular foundation. And really, it's 5 essential steps. It's very linear. People like it because it's step by step. Do this, do this, do this. So first, as we've talked about, we prioritize the standards. And then we name those units of study for each grade level or course. We place the units with priority and supporting standards in them into a sequence that we call the pacing calendar. And that pacing calendar then will show how many weeks each unit will take to implement. It'll build in or include buffer zones or buffer periods between the units. And again, the idea is by this time that the students complete the school year, they'll be prepared for the next level of learning. The other final piece of the foundation is what we call the unit planning organizer. And really what this is a series of planners that allows us to build a template, so to speak, for the unit that describes, the grade level, the course, the duration of the unit. It has the standards. All the components that we've seen thus far are housed within each one of these planners. And rather like planets orbiting the sun, there's an assessment planner, the authentic performance task planner, which I call the engaging learning experiences, how to plan the details, and also so the teachers can write weekly plans and daily plans. But it's, again, an interconnected system of planners that will be used for each unit of study so that we can accomplish what we're trying to accomplish, which is to make sure that the students really learned those standards for each of the units within that grade level. Well, with that, when that overview is created in terms of the scope and sequence of the units, now we start focusing on one unit at a time, and we create or go through what I laughingly refer to as my own 12-step program. It has 12 sequential steps. You see them on the screen. Each one of these is obviously described as the teachers move through the process. The first one being unwrapping the priority standards, which simply means to identify the concepts and the skills the students need to know and be able to do. We create a graphic organizer that is a representation of those unwrapped standards. And one of the really powerful pieces about that graphic organizer step is that we equate the skills that have been identified to Bloom's taxonomy and also Webb's depth of knowledge, so that we can get precision in determining the rigor of each of the skills that have been unwrapped for that particular unit. The educators then plan big ideas and essential questions that will be the larger goals of what they want the students to remember on their own and leave with as they move toward the next unit. Then, with the backwards planning idea in mind, we create the end of unit assessment first. And following that, we create the pre-assessment to match. And so by having the assessments directly aligned to the levels of rigor in the skills and also representing the concepts that were in focus for that unit, we now have the bookends, so to speak, for the unit. Now the focus turns to the actual planning of the day-to-day instruction. So we, in step 6, talk about any additional vocabulary. We want to make sure that we're making interdisciplinary connections, and especially that we're emphasizing 21st century learning skills within the unit design itself so that students have the opportunity to really learn those unwrapped skills and gain those big ideas and demonstrate proficiency on that end of unit assessment. Step 7 is one that's really powerful. That's the authentic performance task piece, where students will actually be engaged in hands-on learning in activities that will enable them to really understand through active participation the standards that they're being asked to learn for that unit. And that very closely relates to gathering instructional resources and materials. And on that point, one thing I really want to say that's a major benefit of this model is the fact that it's not about a commercial program per se. It's about following the framework of a step-by-step process that is completed by the educators within the district. In other words, the ownership piece with educators planning out these steps, deciding what these activities will be, and then looking at all of the available instructional resource materials, both physical and also any resources that are online. They're in charge of designing the curriculum so that they're creating the units of study that are driven by the standards, and it's not the program driving the curriculum. And this is a very major piece, and also why educators have said they love this so much, because they feel like they're having a chance to use their expertise and create powerful units of study that utilizes the materials that they've been given to do that. You'll notice that in number 9, I've highlighted this one as high-impact instructional strategies, because in this step, there are so many different research-based and evidence-based instructional strategies that are in use. I tried to categorize them in terms of 21st century learning skills, research-based effective teaching strategies, differentiation strategies, including enrichment, so that we truly are meeting the needs of all of our students. Also, the response to intervention strategies and the different tiers to make sure that teachers know the appropriate strategy to use to meet the learning needs of the students. The students with IEPs, we want to make sure that their needs are also being met, so there are strategies, instructional strategies that can be utilized to help advance their learning. And then also we want to make sure that our English language learners are receiving the strategies appropriate to their current level of language acquisition. So I just wanted to call out this particular step a little bit to show that we really did go deep into trying to make a comprehensive program, or model I should say, that would allow teachers to accomplish everything they're being asked to accomplish. Lastly, there's a step of detailing the unit planner so that educators can really decide the learning progressions, what order should we be teaching each of the components of the unit, and making sure that we're achieving the purpose of those unwrapped standards. The checks along the way, the informal progress monitoring checks, and then lastly, they can write their own weekly plans and design their own daily lessons. We are not in any way in this model trying to micromanage educators. We want to give them a flexible framework within which to work and apply their expertise. And we also want to provide clear guidance for new teachers who are coming in and trying to make sure that they're doing the very best they can do with all that they've been asked to do with regard to implementing the standards.